The dog stopped suddenly, growling at the rusted steel door buried beneath the snow. The homeless veteran tightened his grip on the leash, heart pounding. He had spent his last $900 on this forgotten Cold War bunker. He thought it would be his grave. He had no idea it was about to become his second chance. The veteran's name was Frank Miller, and the world had quietly forgotten him long ago. Once, he wore a uniform with pride. Now he wore layers of worn coats stitched together by survival. The bunker stood abandoned at the edge of frozen land, its concrete skin cracked by decades of silence. Frank didn't buy it because it was smart. He bought it because it was cheap, and because winter was coming. His dog, Buddy, pressed close to his leg, tail low but loyal. Buddy had been with him through shelters, alleys, and nights when hunger screamed louder than memories. Frank knelt, brushing snow from the dog's ears. "We'll be safe here," he whispered, though doubt burned behind his eyes. Inside the bunker, the air smelled of rust and old fear. Cold War warnings still clung to faded signs on the wall. Frank sat down heavily, exhaustion pulling him apart. He wondered if this was how his story ended, alone, underground, forgotten. But Buddy wouldn't stop sniffing the far corner. He scratched the concrete, whining softly. Frank sighed. "Easy, boy. Nothing left down here." He was wrong, and that mistake was about to change everything. Frank ignored Buddy at first. Hunger and fatigue had dulled his curiosity. He opened a dented can of beans, splitting it with the dog like they always did. The silence was heavy, broken only by Buddy's nails scraping the concrete floor. The sound echoed unnaturally, as if the bunker itself was responding. "All right," Frank muttered, pushing himself up. "What is it?" Buddy rushed back to the corner, nose pressed against a rusted metal locker bolted into the wall. The lock was broken, hanging loose like a forgotten promise. Frank hesitated. In war, unopened doors had consequences. His hand shook, not from fear, but from memory. He pulled the door open. Inside were sealed crates, untouched by time. Frank's breath caught. Military markings stared back at him, faded but unmistakable. He recognized them instantly. Supplies, medical kits, rations. His knees buckled. He sat hard on the floor, staring as if the boxes might vanish. "Buddy," his voice cracked. This isn't real." But it was. For the first time in years, hope didn't feel dangerous. Buddy barked softly, tail wagging, unaware he just dug his human out of despair. Frank's hands trembled as he opened one crate after another. Blankets, emergency heaters, water purification tablets, food packs sealed tight, untouched by decades of dust. Each item felt like a whisper from a past that once believed in survival. He laughed suddenly, sharp, broken laughter that startled even Buddy. "Guess the government finally came through," he said bitterly. As he ate his first warm meal in months, memories flooded in. Nights overseas, friends who never came home, promises made and forgotten. He remembered how he had come back expecting gratitude, only to be handed silence instead. Buddy rested his head on Frank's knee. Frank's hand instinctively stroked the dog's fur, grounding him. "Didn't mean to drag you into this mess," he whispered. "You deserved better." Buddy's tail thumped in response. For the first time, Frank didn't feel like a burden on the world. This bunker, meant for nuclear survival, had become a shelter for a man broken by quieter wars. And though he didn't know it yet, this discovery was only the beginning. The bunker wasn't just hiding supplies. It was hiding a path back to life. Days passed underground, measured not by clocks, but by warmth and breath. Frank cleaned the bunker, clearing debris, making it livable. He shaved for the first time in months, staring at a stranger in a cracked mirror. The man looking back was tired, but alive. Buddy explored every corner, guarding the entrance like a soldier on duty. Frank smiled at the irony. "Looks like you outtrain me now," he joked at 18 night. The silence pressed in. That's when the memories came hardest. Faces of men he couldn't save. Orders he followed that still haunted him. He talked to Buddy then, pouring words into the darkness. Buddy listened always. One night, Buddy began barking frantically at the far wall. Not the locker. Somewhere new. Frank followed, heart racing. Buddy scratched at the concrete again, deeper this time. Frank noticed faint outlines, another sealed door, hidden behind layers of paint and rust. "What are you trying to tell me, boy?" he whispered. With effort, he pried it open. Behind it was not supplies, but records, names, photos, and a truth that would force Frank to face his past in ways he never imagined. The documents were fragile, yellowed with age. Frank flipped through them slowly, his breath growing. Shallow. Names jumped out: soldiers, scientists, civilians, Cold War contingency plans, evacuation lists, and then the familiar surname, Miller. His heart stopped. His father's name stared back at him, listed as a military engineer assigned to the bunker decades ago. Frank sank to the floor, mind racing. His father had vanished when Frank was a child. No body, no answers, just silence. Buddy nudged his hand gently. All this time, Frank had believed his life was a series of endings. But here was proof that his story had roots, unfinished chapters buried under concrete and secrecy. The bunker wasn't random. It was connected to him, to his blood, to his loss. Tears slid down his face, quiet and uncontrollable. "I wasn't abandoned," he whispered. "I was left behind." Buddy rested against him, steady and warm. For the first time, Frank didn't feel homeless. He felt anchored to truth, to memory, and to a future that was slowly, painfully opening its door. Frank spent hours reading the records, his fingers tracing familiar handwriting frozen in time. His father hadn't disappeared by choice. He had stayed behind during an evacuation drill gone wrong, sealing the bunker to protect others from a reactor leak nearby. Officially, he was declared missing. Unofficially, he was erased. Frank leaned back against the cold wall, anger and grief twisting together. His entire life, he'd carried the weight of abandonment, first by a father who vanished, then by a country he served and returned to broken. Now he realized both wounds were connected by the same silence. Buddy whimpered softly, sensing the shift in Frank's breath. "I spent my life fighting ghosts," Frank murmured. "Turns out one of them was family." He found a small footlocker tucked beneath the files. Inside were personal items, a watch, dog tags, a folded photo of a young boy on his father's shoulders. Frank's hand shook violently. It was him. A memory he thought he'd imagined. Tears blurred his vision, but this time they weren't only for loss. They were for truth, for father who stayed when others fled, for a sacrifice no one ever honored. Frank held the dog tags tightly. "You weren't a coward," he whispered. "Neither was I." For the first time, Frank felt pride instead of shame, and that feeling was powerful enough to pull him toward something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. The next morning, Frank made a decision that scared him more than the streets ever had. He would leave the bunker, not to return to homelessness, but to reclaim something he'd lost long ago: his voice. He packed carefully, leaving most supplies behind. But he watched, ears alert, tail low but trusting. "We're not running," Frank said quietly. "We're stepping forward." The town was miles away, and Frank hadn't walked into it sober, with intention in years. People stared at his worn clothes, his dog, the quiet intensity in his eyes. He ignored them. At the public library, he hesitated before the door. Places like this used to intimidate him. Now he pushed through. He asked for help, something he'd avoided his entire life. A librarian listened, then another. Files were pulled. Calls were made. When Frank showed the documents, the room went quiet. One man cleared his throat. "These records were sealed," he said slowly. "They shouldn't exist." "But they do," Frank replied. "And so do I." But he sat at his feet, steady as ever. By evening, word had spread. A reporter asked questions. A veteran's advocate offered coffee. No one treated him like a ghost. Walking back toward the bunker under a sky streaked with orange and gray, Frank realized something profound. Asking for help wasn't weakness. It was the first act of coming home. The story broke quietly at first. A forgotten Cold War bunker. A missing engineer. A homeless veteran who found the truth buried beneath concrete and silence. Then it spread. Journalists came. Historians verified records. Veterans groups reached out. Frank was overwhelmed, retreating to the bunker when the noise became too much. But he stayed close, his calm presence anchoring Frank when the past threatened to swallow him. One evening, a young reporter asked, "Why didn't you give up?" Frank thought about it, about the cold nights, the hunger, the years of being invisible. "Because someone depended on me," he said, nodding toward Buddy. "And because somewhere deep down, I believed my life still meant something." Letters arrived, strangers thanking him, veterans sharing their own stories of being forgotten. Frank read every one, heart heavy but full. A ceremony was planned. His father's sacrifice would finally be recognized. The night before it, Frank sat alone in the bunker, holding the dog tags. "I wish you could have seen this," he whispered, "but maybe you did." Buddy rested his head on Frank's chest, listening to a heartbeat no longer ruled by despair. Frank slept peacefully for the first time in decades. No nightmares, no guilt, just quiet. The ceremony was small but powerful. A flag, a plaque, a name spoken aloud after decades of silence. Frank stood straight, tears cutting lines through weathered skin. Buddy sat proudly beside him, wearing a simple service vest someone had gifted. When Frank was asked to speak, his voice shook, but it didn't break. "My father stayed behind so others could live," he said. "And for a long time, I thought that meant he chose duty over family. Now I know he chose love." Applause followed, but Frank barely heard it. He felt something heavier lift, an invisible burden he'd carried since childhood. Afterward, a woman approached him. "We can help you," she said gently. "Housing, counseling, a fresh start." Frank looked down at Buddy, then back at her. "I'm ready," he said. That night, Frank didn't return to the bunker. He checked into a small transitional home. Buddy curled at his side. The walls were thin. The bed creaked, but it was warm. Safe. Frank stared at the ceiling, smiling softly. "I think we made it," he whispered. Buddy's tail thumped once in agreement. Weeks later, Frank visited the bunker one last time. Snow had begun to melt, revealing earth beneath, life waiting to return. He walked through the room slowly, touching the walls, honoring what this place had given him. "This saved me," he told Buddy, "but we don't belong underground anymore." The bunker would become a memorial, historians said, a place of remembrance. Frank liked that. As they walked away, sunlight warmed Frank's face. He felt lighter, not because the past was erased, but because it was finally acknowledged. Frank wasn't homeless anymore, not because he had a roof, but because he had roots, truth, connection. He knelt, hugging Buddy tightly. "You found more than supplies," he said. "You found our way back." Buddy licked his face, tail wagging wildly. Frank stood and faced the road ahead, uncertain, imperfect, but open. For the first time since the war, he wasn't surviving. He was living. Life in the transitional home felt unfamiliar to Frank, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit yet. The bed was too soft, the silence too clean. For years, chaos had been his companion, and now peace felt almost suspicious. Buddy adjusted faster, stretching out on the floor as if he'd always belonged there. Counseling sessions began slowly. Frank didn't talk much at first. Words had failed him before. But one afternoon, when the counselor asked about his father, something cracked open. Frank spoke for nearly an hour, his voice trembling as decades of grief spilled out. For the first time, someone listened without interrupting, without judgment. That night, Frank dreamed of his father, not disappearing, but standing quietly proud. Frank woke with tears on his face and a strange calm in his chest. Letters kept coming. One stood out, a fellow veteran who wrote, Your story reminded me I'm not alone. Frank held that letter for a long time. Helping others hadn't been his intention, but maybe it was his calling. He began volunteering at a veterans outreach center, Buddy by his side. He listened more than he spoke. Sometimes that was enough. Frank realized healing wasn't a single moment. It was a series of small choices. And for the first time, he was choosing to stay. Frank's presence at the outreach center became a quiet constant. Veterans gravitated toward him, not because he had answers, but because he understood silence. Buddy greeted everyone gently, resting his head on trembling knees, sensing pain where words failed. One afternoon, a young veteran named Luis sat beside Frank, eyes hollow. "I don't think it gets better," Luis said. Frank took a long breath. "I didn't either," he replied, "but sometimes it changes." He told Luis about the bunker, about his father, about how the past didn't disappear, but it stopped controlling him once it was faced. Luis nodded slowly, tears slipping free. Outside, Frank watched the sunset paint the sky in soft golds and blues. He thought about how close he'd come to giving up, how one dog's curiosity had altered the course of his life. That evening, Frank received official confirmation, permanent housing approval, a small apartment. A fresh start. He sat on the floor, Buddy pressed against him, and cried, not from pain, but from gratitude. "We're really doing this," he whispered. Frank understood now. Second chances don't arrive loudly. They come quietly, disguised as persistence, loyalty, and unexpected doors. And sometimes they come with four legs and a wagging tail. Moving day was simple. A few boxes, a leash, a framed photo of his father, finally printed and placed with care. Frank paused at the apartment door, key shaking slightly in his hand. This wasn't just a home. It was proof he still belonged in the world. Inside, sunlight spilled through clean windows. Buddy raced from room to room, claiming the space with joy. Frank laughed, a sound that still surprised him when it escaped. That night, Frank cooked his first real meal in years. Nothing fancy, just something warm and shared. He ate slowly, savoring not just the food, but the moment. Later, he sat on the couch, reflecting on the road behind him. He thought of the nights he slept cold and hungry, believing no one would notice if he disappeared. He thought of his father's sacrifice, and how love could echo through generations, even when buried. Frank wrote a letter, to his father, to himself, to anyone who felt forgotten. He didn't know who would read it, but he hoped someone would feel less alone. Buddy curled up beside him as Frank whispered, "We made it through." And for the first time, the words felt permanent. Frank's story continued to ripple outward. Invitations came, small talks at community centers, quiet conversations with veterans' families. Frank never felt like a hero. He just told the truth. At one event, a young boy approached him, clutching his mother's hand. "My dad's a veteran too," the boy said shyly. Frank knelt, smiling softly. "He's stronger than you know," he replied. Moments like that reminded Frank why survival mattered. Back home, Frank began writing regularly, turning pain into purpose. His words weren't polished, but they were real, and people responded. But he aged gracefully, muzzle turning gray, steps slower, but spirit unchanged. Frank adjusted his pace, understanding now that love meant adapting. One quiet evening, Frank returned to the edge of the land where the bunker lay hidden. He stood in silence, honoring what had been lost and what had been found. "Thank you," he whispered, not to the bunker, but to the journey. He walked away without looking back, because for the first time, his future mattered more than his past. Years later, Frank sat on a park bench, Buddy resting beside him, watching people pass by, laughing, arguing, living. Frank felt no bitterness, only understanding. A reporter once asked, "What saved you?" Frank thought carefully. "Truth," he said, "and love I didn't know was still waiting for me." He spoke of sacrifice, not as loss, but as legacy, of kindness, not as weakness, but as survival. of second chances, not as miracles, but as choices. Buddy shifted closer, warmth steady and familiar. Frank closed his eyes, breathing deeply, grounded in the present. The war no longer followed him everywhere. The streets no longer haunted him. He had built something lasting. Not wealth, not fame, but peace. As the sun dipped low, Frank smiled gently. "We're okay," he whispered. And he meant it. Buddy's health began to decline quietly, the way true companions do, without complaint. His walks grew shorter, his breathing slower. Frank noticed every change. After everything they had survived together, this felt like the hardest battle yet. The veterinarian spoke gently, explaining age and time. Frank nodded, but inside, fear tightened its grip. But he wasn't just a dog. He was the reason Frank survived the cold, the hunger, the loneliness. He was the one constant when the world turned away. Frank rearranged his life around Buddy's comfort. He cooked soft meals, carried him when stairs were too much, slept on the floor when Buddy couldn't climb onto the bed anymore. Each act felt like repayment for a debt that could never truly be settled. At night, Frank talked to him, the way he once spoke in the bunker. "You saved me," he whispered. "Now let me be here for you." Buddy's eyes still held that same calm loyalty. One afternoon, Frank took Buddy to the park. They sat beneath a tree, sunlight filtering through leaves. Buddy rested his head on Frank's leg, breathing slowly, peacefully. Frank understood then that love wasn't about holding on forever. It was about showing up until the very end. And he wasn't going anywhere. The morning Buddy passed was quiet. No alarms, no fear, just stillness. Frank held him, feeling the last breath leave the body that had carried him through darkness into light. Frank didn't cry immediately. He simply sat there, hand resting on Buddy's chest, honoring the moment. Grief arrived later, heavy, unavoidable, but gentle in its own way. He buried Buddy beneath the same kind of tree where they once sat together, placing the service vest carefully beside him. "You were my home," Frank whispered. For days, the apartment felt unbearably silent. No pause on the floor. No steady presence at his side. Frank questioned whether he could face the world alone again. But then the letters came. People he had helped. Veterans he had listened to. Strangers who said a story saved them from giving up. Frank realized Buddy's purpose hadn't ended. It lived on in him. He returned to the outreach center, heart heavy but open. He spoke honestly about loss, about loving knowing it will hurt, and choosing to love anyway. That was Buddy's final lesson, and Frank carried it forward. Frank began mentoring veterans formally, guiding them through housing applications, counseling, and, most importantly, self-forgiveness. He never positioned himself as healed. He presented himself as human. He kept Buddy's photo on his desk, not as a reminder of pain, but of endurance. One winter evening, Frank stood before a small group and said, "I once spent my last dollars on a bunker because I thought that was all my life was worth." Silence filled the room, but inside that darkness, he continued, "I found truth, love, and a second chance because someone stayed with me." Some cried, others nodded. Frank understood now that survival wasn't enough. Meaning came from connection. Outside, snow began to fall. Frank stepped into it, breathing deeply. The cold no longer scared him. He knew warmth existed, sometimes in places no one thinks to look. Frank smiled softly. He was no longer defined by what he lost, but by what he carried forward. Years later, Frank returned to the memorial bunker. It stood preserved now, a quiet tribute to sacrifice and resilience. Visitors walked slowly, reading names, touching walls, feeling history breathe. Frank placed his hand over his father's name. "I finally understand," he whispered. He added another small plaque nearby. Buddy's name. No rank, no title, just loyalty. Frank sat on a bench, watching families pass through. He felt no bitterness, only gratitude. Life hadn't become perfect. It became meaningful. He had loved, he had lost, and he had chosen to keep going. Frank stood, shoulders steady, heart full. The man who once thought this bunker would be his grave now knew it was his beginning. Frank walked away from the bunker one last time. Footsteps light, back straight. He wasn't alone, not really. Love doesn't vanish. It transforms. He lived now for those who couldn't, for those still lost, for the quiet voices waiting to be heard. And every time Frank helped someone stand back up, Buddy was there, in spirit, in strength, in loyalty that never fades. The world hadn't changed overnight, but Frank had. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. Some lives are rebuilt in silence, through loyalty, truth, and second chances. If this story touched your heart, remember, hope often waits where we least expect it. Like, subscribe, and join our Heart Angels family.